Although Bradford has a history going back well over 1,000 years, its reputation as a leading English city was made as recently as the 19th century, when the town was a locus classicus of urban industrial growth. Peel back the veneer of that Victorian city, and we uncover vestiges of a much older community. The place name of Bradford is derived from the Old English brada, meaning broad, and ford, meaning a passage across a stream. Beneath our feet here at Goytside is one of 4 small streams or becks which flow down from the surrounding hills and meet at Bradford. The word Goyt is another word for mill race, the watercourse which drove the medieval water corn mill. For early people, the natural crossing point of a watercourse was important and attracted early clearance and settlement. In a secluded side valley of the River Aire, the site at Bradford presented better natural conditions for defence and was perhaps healthier than the damp, heavily wooded valley of Airedale. The early settlement of timber housing with thatched roofs was probably confined to the area close to the site of the present parish church, a cathedral since 1919, first mentioned in the Register of Archbishop Wickwayne in 1281. By 1600, the single-storied timber houses of medieval Bradford had given way to plain, 2-storied houses of stone. The town became a compact little market community of narrow streets and alleys, which climbed steeply up the hill on the west side of the Bradford Beck. The late Tudor town of Bradford was approximately T-shaped. The vertical stem was Kergate, beginning at the valley bottom close to Broadstones and climbing up to the junction of Ivegate and Westgate. To the left of this junction, Ivegate dropped steeply down to the Sun Bridge, and to the right, Westgate ran upwards to Sillsbridge Lane and then into open countryside. This later map of 1722 confirms this triple street arrangement of the small market town's urban core for nearly 500 years. Here today, at the junction of these 3 ancient highways, we're surrounded by numerous chain stores of the 21st century Britain, lots of concrete and glass, all serving the needs of the modern shopper. But just across the way there, the symbol of Bradford's traditional retailing system, the ancient market cross, has found refuge in the foyer of the modern marketplace, only a few yards from its original location on this spot where we stand today. Looking down Kirkgate towards the parish church in 1800, our visitor would have been able to view the recently built manor house with its Georgian facade, fine avenue of walks and beautiful gardens. For a long time this was the house of the Rawson family, but by 1830 this fine house was overrun by Bradford's market and retailing needs, as hawkers, cheapjacks and market stalls of every description occupied its grounds. On the opposite side of the road from the manor house was the Talbot Hotel, which many might remember by its distinctive figure of a bloodhound above the main entrance. This was one of the town's earliest coaching houses, the Union coach calling daily on its run from Leeds to Kendal. It's in the true nature of towns to change, and Bradford is no exception to that rule. Looking around today, these pictures show how the city centre has changed from the paintings and illustrations of the town 200 years ago. That town gave way to an explosion of wealth and economic expansion in Bradford's staple industry, the making of worsted cloth. Between 1770 and 1870, Bradford passed from the status of a small West Yorkshire market town to become the world centre of the woolen and worsted manufacture, a veritable Worstedopolis, as one writer put it. In 1900, a trade correspondent of the Bradford Observer remarked, "If we look around at our mills, our warehouses and our public buildings, it needs no great effort to imagine that Bradford is built of wool." Traditionally, since the 16th century at least, Halifax and the Upper Calder Valley had been the heartland of worsted textile production. However, with the introduction of steam-powered worsted spinning in the 1790s, Bradford began to overtake Halifax as the industry began a gradual transition from domestic and water-powered production to urban steam-powered factory manufacture. Thanks to a plentiful supply of cheap local coal and the development of engine-making ironworks on the town's doorstep at Low Moor, Bowling, Birkenshaw and Shelf, Bradford soon left Halifax in its wake, and by 1840 had even replaced Leeds as the mercantile centre for worsted goods. Bradford's earliest township mill was built by Messrs. Ramsbottom, Swain and Murgatroyd in 1798. This was the home mill between Thornton Road and Little Horton Lane, later rebuilt by Richard Fawcett. The size and scale of Bradford's mills increased throughout the 19th century as more processes became mechanised. Barker End Mill was built in 1820 for William and James Garnett as a spinning and weaving mill. Following the mechanisation of combing in 1845, Titus Salt centralised all three processes under one roof in his huge manufactory at Saltaire. In 1870, Samuel Cunliffe Lister erected a vast and imposing mill at Manningham, covering 16 acres of floor area and dominated by a 250-foot chimney.
There, a cast iron boiler, all built into the fireplace. And of course the heat from the fire warmed the water up in the boiler. And that was, you had a ladling can. Put your ladling can in the boiler and you took it to your sink, which was what we call the cellar head. The cellar head was the top of the cellar steps. It would be about 4 by 4. And you had a stone sink in there and your tap, and you only had a cold water tap. Grandmother and grandmother lived with us, so you could imagine there was 8 of us at that time when I was born in that house, in a 2-bedroom. We slept in with his mother and father, 4 in a bed.
When it was bath night, we had a big zinc bath, and that was lifted down from the wall outside and put in the living room. And there were 5 of us then getting bathed, and Kathleen and myself were the first because the lads were dirtier. And so it ended up with Thomas being last, bless him, who was always last. And we slept together. We had this 1-bedroom, and there were 5 of us in the 1-bedroom. And in the winter time, I used to sleep in the middle because it was warmer. And in the summertime, when it was really warm, we used to put Thomas in the middle. Because, you know, you wanted your legs out of the bed a bit, it was cool. We had blankets on our beds, and a lot of children in those days, they used to put the coats on the beds at night.
By 1901, there were still over 530 examples of the infamous Victorian cellar dwellings in Bradford. And as late as 1922, 14,000 Bradfordians continued to live in 3,700 Victorian hovels of one kind or another. However, in 1907, the council replaced some of the worst slums in Westgate with the city's first council tenements at Longlands. Conventional council housing followed in Bankfoot, but this was ended abruptly by the outbreak of war in 1914. Addison's Housing Act of 1919 gave financial encouragement to corporations like Bradford to provide homes for working-class rental, and as a result of the 23,000 new homes built in Bradford between 1919 and 1939, over 10,000 were council houses on new estates at Haworth Road, Wetley Lane and Canterbury Avenue. Many of these new homes beyond the city centre were direct replacements for the back-to-back homes of the Industrial Revolution. A final surge of council housing occurred between 1950 and 1962, when over 10,000 houses and flats were built at Thorpe Edge, Byerley, Homewood and Netherlands Avenue. Elsewhere in Bradford, there were examples of fine Victorian villa residences, the homes of Bradford's affluent manufacturing middle classes and home-owning families who lived in the better-off enclaves of Little Horton Green, Manningham, Heaton and Hanover Square. By 1860, the most fashionable area of homes for the middle and employer classes, who surrounded themselves with gardens, trees and flowers, was the St Paul's Road area of Manningham. If ordinary working men and women could not afford luxury homes and gardens like this, they were never far away from pleasant environments. They were never very far away from a public park. The public park movement had begun in Bradford as early as 1863 with the provision of Peel Park as an antidote to Victorian Bradford's low moral tone. Others followed at Lister Park in 1870, Horton Park in 1878, Bowling Park in 1880, Bradford Moor in 1884. Industrialisation and urbanisation had done much to remove the traditional playgrounds of the lower classes. And due to a combination of growing civic pride and private philanthropy, Bradford did much to recompense this loss by the provision of municipal parks and a variety of recreations. Even so, Bradfordians did not stick fast, for they'd already begun to lay out for themselves escape routes from the clatter of the weaving shed and the bustle of the city streets. J.B. Priestley, born in Bradford in 1894, once wrote, "Bradford itself is ugly and forbidding, and yet within the easiest reach of its town hall square is some of the loveliest country in England. When you're in the town, you feel as you glance round at the hills bristling with dark chimneys that you'll never see a green field again, and yet you only have to take a tram or a bus, and you find yourself on a moor top with not a chimney in sight." One of the favourite routes out of the city was via a Manningham Lane tram to Saltaire's Victoria Road, and by way of the single-track Woodland Tramway onto Shipley Glen, Dick Hudson's and Ilkley Moor. Traditionally, retailing in Bradford was done from a number of different markets scattered across the town. We've already heard about the ancient meat market or shambles located in the triangular opening at the top of Ivegate and Kergate, and the butter market close by on the ground floor of the toll booth in Ivegate. By 1830, there were other small markets for general sales and specialised trading in fruit, vegetables and earthenware. A fruit and pottery market was located in Kergate in front of the old manor house. Fruit and vegetables were sold on the higher side of the marketplace. The green market was located on the site of Rawson Place, and behind Christchurch was the fairground and open poultry market. The shift to fixed shop retailing had begun by 1835, although many of these were mere extensions of the proprietor's house. Bradford's earliest shopping zone was in Westgate, where small, locally owned family businesses catered for Bradford's growing consumer needs in the Victorian times, but between 1870 and 1880 a number of large multi-storey shops were erected for the sale of drapery and furnishings. For example, Mrs. Couson's drapery store at the bottom of Ivegate became George Thorpe's House Furniture Emporium and one of the largest stores in Bradford.
They were nearly all cowboys and Indians in them days, and she'd be playing all sorts of loud music, and of course we'd be cheering and shouting out, "He's behind you!" you know, and all that kind of thing. And
the first talkie film was shown at Darley Street Savoy Cinema in March 1929.
I remember going to see the first talking film in 1929. I was 5 years old, and I went with my mother, auntie and sister. And it was a very moving picture and made everybody cry. And as we were coming home on the tram, the conductor looked at us and said, "I know where all you've been." And he said, "You've been to see the film at the Savoy Theatre." And I suppose every night he'd have folk with tearful eyes and red eyes.
Picture Saturday night, I mean, that was a big night, Saturday night. You got your best suit on, which you weren't allowed to wear during the week. In fact, We used to go, if we went to pictures during the week with the local pictures, we used to go in as overalls, what we'd wore during the mill. And Saturday night was a dressed up night with the starch collars and there's brill cream on, fancy dress, best suit. And we'd go to the Ritz or the Odeon, New Victoria, sixpence, the best seats.
The New Victoria Cinema was an absolutely wonderful place. It was very grand indeed, and it was a great treat to be taken there. I remember being taken to children's films there during the war. And I think the nice thing about it was that it had the most wonderful theatre organ, which I'm sure I remember was called the Mighty Wurlitzer. It was very much an occasion to go to the New Victoria, or the New Vic as it was known, as it was so much grander than any of the small cinemas in the suburbs that we also went to. There was a ballroom, it was a very large complex, there was a ballroom, and in fact my husband and I met in the ballroom when we were 15 years old at a Wool Association dance. But I think there was a resident orchestra there.
Dancing, well, of course, there was 3 or 4 dance halls in Bradford. There was the Textile Hall, there was Gledhill's, which was run by a man and wife. This is in the 30s, and amazingly, Gledhill's, they had pillars. It was pillars all around the dance floor, so you could bump into them. You could bump into these pillars when you were twirling your girlfriend round or whatever, and bounce off these pillars many a time.
During the late 1950s and 1960s, cinemas like the Gaumont fulfilled a dual role, acting as venues for the new icons of popular music like the Beatles and Rolling Stones, and before them, in 1958, for Buddy Holly and the Crickets. Bradfordians made a huge contribution to both world wars, and the city felt the impact of both wars socially and economically. Bradford was one of the most vibrant and upbeat cities of the Edwardian era. That Edwardian confidence and optimism were wiped out on the 4th of August 1914 with the declaration of war on Germany. The flood of volunteers outside the town's barracks at Bellevue led to the formation of a Citizens' Army League, which permitted Bradford to raise, feed and train its own battalions until the War Office was able to receive them into the regular army. It was officially known as the 16th Battalion, Prince of Wales' own West Yorkshire Regiment. Later, with a 2nd Battalion, the 18th, they came to be known as the Bradford Pals. Of the 770 men of the 16th Battalion who went over the top on the 1st of July 1916, 515 were reported killed, seriously wounded or missing by the 3rd of July. The 18th Battalion's casualties were also 70% in the carnage of the Somme. The Bradford Daily Telegraph on the 7th of July 1916 informed its readers under a headline of "Paying the Price" of the terrible significance of what had happened to the city's menfolk. The war has laid a terribly heavy hand on our city in the last 2 or 3 days. Scores of homes have suddenly been plunged into grief, and amongst them are many well-known families. Bradford now realizes to the full what it is to be at war. In the days following, the newspaper columns were taken up by photographs of the local dead and missing. It was during the war years that Bradford experienced a most dramatic disaster. Just after 3 o'clock on the afternoon of Monday, the 21st of August 1916, a small fire started close to 30,000 pounds of picric acid. The fire spread quickly and led to a series of explosions which lasted 2 days and culminated in a huge detonation of a nearby gasometer, killing 2 firemen from Odsal Station and 4 from Nelson Street. In all, 339 people were killed and 60 were injured. Following so soon after the decimation of the PALS battalions, few Bradfordians ever forgot where they were or what they were doing when Low Moor Works went up. In 1939, for the second time in one generation, Bradfordians were forced into war against Germany in the shape of Adolf Hitler and his National Socialists. This time, with the homeland itself under threat from the bombs of the Luftwaffe, it became a people's war. Bradford, however, escaped lightly from the Blitz. The city was bombed only 5 times, with few casualties and relatively little physical damage. More sustained bombing occurred on the night of the last day in August 1940, when over 100 bombs seriously damaged several buildings in the city, killing 1 person. That night, the hotel, a transport interchange, and the conversion of the National Museum of Photography, Film and Television. The modern city of the 20th century has now overrun the ancient and historic core of Ivegate, Westgate and Kergate, and takes Bradford and its people into the 3rd millennium.